Thank you, Jorge, for initiating this project of ours. This will be our first podcast of Millennial Boomer. Of course, I am the boomer. I'm 66 years old. I was born in 1951, smack in the middle of the baby boom generation, which began shortly after the war and ended around 1960. So I'm right practically in the middle of it. Third of four brothers. Family still came in economy size in those days. I went to public school in Montreal. I've lived in Montreal all my life. I went to McGill University, graduated with a degree in political theory, did some graduate work in English, and have lived mainly by my pen throughout my career as a director of communications, as a editor of a magazine, as the author of 4 books. And I love Montreal. I love Canada. I took part in the struggle during the 1980 referendum and the 1995 referendum to keep our country together. Although I outrank you in age by almost a third of a century or more, I still feel that I can relate to you very, very well as a human being, although probably not idea-wise in all respects, and that is why we are here. So I've introduced myself. I invite you to introduce yourself.
So yes, I am Jorge Savano. I was born in Argentina a few years later, 1986. I think that's more towards the beginning of the millennial generation. It's a generation that it's weirdly being argued. I feel for baby boomers it's more like accepted. I don't know if that happens with time, but some say that began in the 80s, like any baby 80s to early 2000s, that's a millennial. So I'm in most people's account, I'm in the millennials. So I'm 30. And migrated to Canada with my family after living in Panama for a few years. I did not go to public school in Montreal, went to an English private school, and then went to Concordia for communications with a film minor. I have been working in film industry for about almost 10 years, while being in university. I've been working in documentaries, mostly post-production and also some editing and videography work that I have done. Yeah, that's a basic where I'm at. We have a bit of a different...
Why did you invite me to participate in this dialogue with you? What do you expect us to achieve here?
Well, first I feel like I want to give some history to how we got here, because that started, I don't even know exactly how many years ago, but it must be over 10, about in that realm, 12.
It's about 17 years since you arrived here.
Yeah.
And I met you and your family when you arrived, and you were still a kid.
Okay.
And you had some, while you were growing up, you had some, what ideas that I would define as wild.
So yes,
against which I presented you with some, let's say, more conservative ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I even tempered your wildness to some extent. But there's still a gap between us in certain respects. And I think that's why we're here, to see if we can bridge the generational divide. If not, that divide is a stimulus to reaching some insights about the difference between our two generations.
Yeah, I think yes, you have it perfectly there. We had some good discussions, and I think that we figured out that even when we were at our farthest away, because 18-year-old me definitely was far away from what you were thinking, and maybe even from what I'm thinking today. And I think we were still able to have discussions. We were still able to come at the end of it and say, we didn't shake hands, but we almost did in a way of like, that was fun. So,
How would we define the differences that we had then, and how would we explain the gap being closed between then and now? Let's first look at what divided us then. I would define it as the political left, which you represented, while I was much, much more on the right. Although I would hasten to define the right from my own perspective and not from what many people out there might think of as the right. Would you have described yourself as a socialist?
yes. I can even make an argument today and age that many things that I think are still in the socialist realm. We can discuss labeling and that's a whole discussion about how we try and label ourselves, or how people label, are you far right, conservative, liberal, socialist? Like, it is tough. But I think, especially we're going back 10 years, it was a way more militant mentality. It was a mentality that socialism could work, and I was really just learning about all the injustices in the world, and I would just sit down and think, how can I fix that injustice? And it would be just, this is the solution I can come up with. This is the fair solution, which led me to socialism mostly, because if you're just coming up, and this was also at the time that I was studying communication, and I would take many courses in political science and things throughout. So there was a lot of, I was just learning. So you might be getting the brunt of my trying to come up with an idea of how we can fix this part of society or that injustice. So I think that's something that maybe has changed. It's a little more like,
As I recall your 18-year-old self, you were not only a socialist, but you were a anti-capitalist. And I draw a distinction there. There are many socialists out there that I have respected and will respect. But when they become rabidly anti-capitalist as well, there's a distinction. Because you could point to a country like Sweden and say that it's a socialist country. And I would argue in return that no, it is capitalist in its economy and socialist in its distribution of wealth. But without the IKEAs and the Ericssons of Sweden, you wouldn't have any wealth to distribute, because it is those capitalists who are creating the wealth in the first place. I believe that today you have evolved and you are not an anti-capitalist, although you remain in many respects a socialist. Is that a fair description?
It's fair. I think maybe age has brought a bit of pessimism in my thinking that, like, if I just say, oh, capitalism is bad, and I feel I can make that argument quickly, all the bad things about it, but it's also the most viable thing that we got going on right now, and without a major revolutionary change. And I know that that's what we got, that's what we have to work with. So I think throughout the years I have been taking more the approach of like, okay, this is what we have to work with. We're 7 billion people in the world. How can we make this work? So I think, like, I still don't appreciate capitalism. I'm not a fan of it. I still think that there's other options that, if it wasn't for the fact that humans are slightly evil, that might be an exaggeration, but capitalism still has a lot of things I don't like about it. I
think I can draw an historical parallel to your own evolution. I went to university 1968 to 1972. Those were my 4 years of university at McGill. I was very much in the minority because I was pro-capitalist, whereas those were the years of the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam movement, and the anti-capitalist movement among students. So I was an iconoclast in my generation because I was pro-capitalism. That generation of mine, the 60s generation, if you look at them now, they will repeat the old joke to you. If you're not a socialist when you're young, you don't have a heart. But if you're not a capitalist when you're older and you've lived life, you don't have a brain. Because you understand that it is the motivating force of individuals and their capacity for initiative as individuals that ultimately is the creator of wealth in this world. That's my perspective on your own evolution, because you have begun to live life, so you've evolved, and you will live life more in the next 25 years, and you may very well come to the same place intellectually where I am now.
Not sure that to be seen, I guess. I don't like that joke, just because I think it comes from that heart part of caring when they were younger and wanting to do change. And then later on, I think they might have just become more egotistical and more like individualist. So that sense of community and what's fair, people are willing to put a blind eye just because they're like, I'm tired, it's tough. And we'll just, under the excuse of capitalism, may do things that are just unfair, and they come ahead, if that makes sense. So I'm not 100% sure if it's like that, if it's an evolution that will happen to me. I'm gonna try.
I would argue, as I've argued with you over the years, that capitalism is actually more moral than socialism, because capitalism ensures the liberty of the individual and the freedom of the individual to retain the fruits of his or her labor. Ultimately, what a capitalist is, and I would describe myself, besides being a capitalist, as a libertarian. And what is the root of the word libertarian? But liberty. Liberty to express oneself, liberty to work as one wishes to work, and most of all, liberty to hold on to one's property, having created it. The state is a coercive force, and the extent to which the state impedes the individual is what I argue against when I'm arguing against socialism, because socialism says to the individual, you are part of a group whether you like it or not. Your property, your income is going to be used for the benefit of the group whether you like it or not. And the state ultimately holds a gun and can hold it to my head and your head and say, you are contributing to the collective welfare, whether you like it or not, through your taxes. And they can raise the taxes as high as they wish. And they can seize as much of my property and as much of my income as they wish. That is socialism. That is what I'm against, because ultimately I see it as counterproductive. And I would point to historical examples, which we can get to.
But there's two sides to that coin too. Like the other side of that exact, that same gun can protect you. Right now, you're not in the position of being oppressed by other people. But in the socialist environment, that gun can turn around and say, hey, leave this person alone. Just because they are this or that doesn't mean that you can take advantage of them. So, I'm taking your money because you got lucky once and this person got unlucky. Let's help them out because, we're all going to die in the end. It's like there's that same idea, that same freedom that you can have in libertarian, that same freedom that lets you do whatever you want, no one's going to steal your land, also allows the person across the street to come over and steal your land. It's not the government that does it, but it allows the guy in front of you to steal it from you. And unless you got the bigger gun, if they have the bigger gun, they win. And it's all fun and games until you're not faced with being a minority until you're not faced with being not lucky. Lucky is a big part of capitalism. There's a certain degree of where you were born, how you were raised. Just did you make the right phone call at the right time and manage to get this contact on this other one? And socialism, yeah, it's where I'm getting older. I think I'm seeing more like there's two coins to all this. That same gun that protects you is the gun that will also could be used against you.
Please do not mistake the libertarian view of what the state should do. The libertarian says the state does have proper functions. When you talk about the neighbor across the street coming to seize my land, the state exists in order to enforce property rights of individuals.
But how do we get to those property rights? Like how do we
Honest
how do you make the
self-interest,
claim?
honest
Honesty?
labor,
But if we had honesty,
and
all social systems would work.
and
Capitalism, all like, if people
the state
were
is there also to provide a court system so
Okay.
that dishonesty can be prosecuted, so that civil disputes can be litigated. The libertarian does not advocate the end of the state. The state has proper functions. Many of the arguments that you make against capitalism are standard pillars of the anti-capitalist mentality. They assume that bad people will triumph. And be assured that libertarianism and capitalism are not based upon something as anarchistic as that view that you seem to hold. And I, as a libertarian, I probably would be called a soft libertarian because I don't take my views to the extreme of that some libertarians do, that everything should be in the economy should be privatized. But again, we could get to that at some future time. We should try to focus more on this introductory podcast of
Right.
ours on what are the differences between the millennials and the baby boomers.
Okay. Let's try this. I was trying to think about it. I think that something that I'm trying to see if it's a big difference is the growing up in the age of information and not being to not be aware that what we do has very global and huge consequences, i.e. If I have my cell phone, I have the information today and age that I know that it had to be mined and there was issues, labor issues and global warming to get the cell phone or whatever I have. So I'm wondering if I'm growing up with knowing that like there's consequences for everything we do. There has been a lot of like, you have to not feel bad, if that makes sense, but like feel responsibility for all the things that are happening. And I'm feeling that baby boomers, especially maybe not as much today, but when they were coming up, it was more of the age of we're just going to make the biggest building. If we can sell more clothing across the world, we will put it on ships and it will pollute, but whatever. If we have a mine, let's make it the biggest mine we can make it. And there was a more attitude of we're just going for greatness. And I find right now, with talking to people my generation, we don't have that same mentality because we know like, oh, you want to make a mine the biggest possible? It's like, yeah, what happens if this happens? What about the environmental costs? What about, I wonder if that's a difference that we can pinpoint. That
I can understand and appreciate the wish on your generation's part to preserve the environment and to make sure that the air we breathe is pure. But again, I have to come back to thinking that your generation is fighting the primary forces of wealth creation in the world. And using the environment and whether or not the air is polluted as excuses to attack the basic forces that create wealth in the world.
But would you say that could be like the way of thinking part? Because it's just not even just the environment, also social issues. Now, like if look at the companies, and some could even say it's fake, but whatever. Look at the new companies that are coming up. They have this willing that they want to be socially correct. You know, that is they're thinking about that when they're making a new company.
It's the new religion in business.
Right, like it's this, you know, Google had this whole do no evil, and I have to put a big had because now it's a alphabet, and I don't know what if their do no evil still stands.
Yeah.
But like I think that mentality of like, oh, we need to be good, we need to be
Sustainable.
conscious, sustainable, all that might not be as much in the baby boomers like mentality in dealing with issues. So you know what I mean, like that libertarian part that you're saying, like, well,
This is where I probably have to depart from many of my fellow baby boomers because they are, of course, sharing those views with you. All through my life, I have been at odds with many of the views of my own generation. So maybe I'm not a typical baby boomer for you to have invited to this dialogue.
yeah, we should make it clear for every, like, the clear part of this podcast is not to assume that we represent, because that would be the worst thing. We don't represent everybody. The biggest reason I have come to want to make this podcast is because I find that in the media or YouTube or the radio, podcast, whatever, it's a lot of people that hold their opinions very like, I represent this, and everything I think about has to come through this glass, this filter. You look at the CNN has one filter, Fox News has one filter, the left, the right, everyone, and this discussion is to for one, it's like not everything you think about will come through one filter. Not everything I think about will come through one filter. And bigger thing, we are probably wrong a whole bunch. We might have one idea, and then someone else can turn around and be like, this one's better.
Let me emphasize that I certainly do not represent my generation in many, many respects. And as I was coming over here this morning, for some reason it occurred to me to remember, of all people, Che Guevara. My generation. It was my generation that put that man's face on posters and on T-shirts. And yet, I know for a fact, or for my own reality, that Che Guevara was not a good human being and was not a model human being. He wanted to bring rapid industrialization to Cuba in much the same way that Mao wanted to bring rapid industrialization to China. And of course, as we know, both efforts were complete failures. He, Che Guevara, was the man who, post-revolutionary Cuba, helped establish Cuba's Gulag and helped establish the firing squads for dissenters within Cuba. This was a bad, evil man. My generation deified him. Even today, you find everywhere in the world his face on T-shirts as if he is someone to idolize and follow.
That's something that I could, if I don't know if I can make a super blanket statement, but I dealt with it, and I know a lot of my friends had to deal with it, which is at that age that one is more revolutionary, and Che Guevara was cool to get a T-shirt and the whole thing. I had Che Guevara shirts, and it, with the idea of the information age, or like you can't hide from the fact that in 2 seconds you were like, oh, he tortured a lot of people. Oh, he wanted revolution. He was really into the violent revolution part of things, because even when he was done in Cuba, he just went looking for that, was it Congo?
Yes, the Congo.
He was looking for that. And I had that issue. I was sold this Che Guevara, who was this revolution, fairness, and all that. And then go read a book or read an article or anything, and you're faced with this, like, well, this isn't, like,
Curiously, Che Guevara was an Argentinian by birth, correct?
Yeah, he was born in the same town as my dad. So there was a lot of it that's Argentinian. And you're like, we have Che Guevara, we have Maradona. We had like, there was many in the 80s. That's like the 90s. That's who you looked up to as an Argentinian. And it's a weird one. Whatever happened, I don't know if he's to this day still being seen as power,
An icon.
an icon of. It's just more like the icon of revolution, and people are a little more scared. Again, we're a little scared of, was it fair? Is it sustainable? Was that the best way you can go about it? Because he was saying more overthrow. Because even if you're against it right now, I don't know if.
Well, consider me delighted to learn that you actually share my view of Che Guevara, because I'm certain that the vast majority of millennials out there, if they hear that name or see that iconic image of the T-shirts and the posters, would say, "Oh, he must have been a good guy."
I don't. It's a tough one. It's the same way with my generation loves Wikipedia. We'll have a discussion, and if someone says something, we'll go and Google it. Like I'm the bad one at that. I can be at a party and pull out my phone and Google whatever the discussion is, to be like, hey guys, can we try and be like official about it? I think there was a lot of myth that have been debunked with information, and it's tough. Che Guevara is one of them. And even when we're talking about Che Guevara, my reasons might be different than your reasons. Mine's more on the his violent and torturous side. Yours could be added to what he was promoting and the ideas that he was promoting. So there's a little caveat on that. But what's Mahatma Gandhi? He had a little things that once you found out with information, the myth of him, and you're like, oh, we have too much information for that myth to hold. He did a few things that were not sustainable. Let's put that word. I feel it's not the right word, but he did the whole thing with antibiotics for his wife. There's all those little facts that make you feel weird about it. And lately, I even read an article about Mother Teresa. Whole issues about the way she did things and how maybe they weren't as good as the myth that we want to put on. So I don't want to put that as a generational thing. I can put it on maybe as a today and age thing. Doesn't matter how old you are. We both have access to Wikipedia. We both could go and read articles. And I don't know if those three pillars, with the information we have now, we can hold on to them.
Tell me if I shouldn't be worried when I read statistics about the number of books that exist in the homes of millennials.
Mm-hmm.
It approaches zero. It approaches zero. It is true. They have their computers, they have their iPads, they have their iPhones, they have, through those devices, connection to all of the world's knowledge. But they don't read books.
I will have to, again, Google this, and I don't know how we'll do this in the podcast to try and be proper. But there was an article, I saw statistics saying that this generation was reading more than your generation. That is a fact.
Reading more books, or reading
more
more
books.
Twitter feeds? And,
no, more books.
I would very much
I will have to
be interested in learning that. I would be relieved. I would be astonished.
Yeah, no, I will. I saw it purely because everyone was going, really? That makes no sense. But I think there might be an issue with how easy it is to access information, that part. But to whoever's listening out there in the waves, we'll have to come up with a system that after we do the podcast, we will put a post when we put the picture, the video and audio of it. We'll try and add any links to as many things as we can that we might see appropriate. Like this case, it would be, was I right about this or not? And we will try and post it. Or, there I mentioned
Good point.
little things. We'll try and add as much as we can so that when you listen to this or whoever is listening, they can come up with their own discussions. And if there's an article that we mention, we'll post it so that it's perfectly.
We should use the few remaining minutes of this podcast to judge our own performance in this, our inaugural podcast.
Ooh.
I suspect that we've been a little too scattered, that we should rein in ourselves and force ourselves in future podcasts to focus more on 1, 2, or 3 issues. It's true, we're finding our way, we're finding our feet. I think we had a good talk, but if I were to judge it from what I've heard, we require more focus, and we will, be assured, listeners, we will improve our our performance.
Well, I mean, I think, and we had discussed it other times in preparation to the podcast, that we can definitely choose a subject and have a time limit and do it that way. And I think that will be the future. But hopefully this, and in the scatteredness of it, showed more who we are and kind of how the discussion goes. I am a fan of the scattered discussion because I think sometimes it leads to good places, but having a time limit can help things, and having subjects or things that happen discussed will keep us way more on a straight line, I guess.
And may provide an opportunity for us to verbally go at each other's throats, which could
Right.
provide the fireworks that we want to create in our podcast so that we will excite our listeners.
Yeah. That, but I do hope that people don't think that we will be shouting at each other, because as the tagline for the podcast is the search for common ground. That's for me, and I don't know if this will make a less interesting podcast. I don't think so. It is more important for us to accept that we're not fighting. We're both in this, we're in this world together, wanted it or not. Yet we can definitely not agree on things and let it be known, because it's important to that. Because I know there's, even today, we weren't discussing things, but I saw things that I'm like, I agree with you there. And that's...
We both have a high regard for courtesy, respect, mutual respect, and this is something that we have seen actually draining out of the world based upon certain events that have happened politically in the politics of our southern neighbor. I'm certain that will be a topic of conversation, but we will never shout at each other.
Never say never.
We will maintain the level of decorum that we have demonstrated in this talk.
Yep. This is 34 minutes, and I think that's right where we want it to be. We have a website, millennialboomerpodcast.com. It's a long name, but it makes sense, and it tells everyone what the podcast is about. We have a Twitter account, which is Milboom Podcast at Twitter. But if you go to the website, we'll be posting everything. We'll have, with whatever we discuss, we'll add some links, and we'll get it going every week. We'll have a discussion between 30 and 45 minutes. We'll try and keep it around there. Not too long, not too short. And anything else?
I just want to thank you for initiating this, because it would never have occurred to this boomer, who is actually a technophobe, to have initiated such a project. So I thank you, and I look forward to our next encounter.
Perfect. And we're done.